This is my journey. Inspired one story at a time, a library of leaders was created. It began as a journey to learn. As time went on, it began to grow. All it needed was a platform, and this podcast was created to listen, to inspire, to share. I am a storyteller, and this is my journey. Welcome to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. I'm your host, Steve Anderson, and our guest today is Margot Machol Bisnow, who has spent 20 years in government, including as an FTC Commissioner and Staff Director of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. For the last 10 years, she has spoken to parent groups about raising creative, confident, resilient children who achieve their dreams. She served as an advisor to EQ Generation, an after-school program in New York City that gives children the skills to succeed. And also she served on the advisory board of the MUSE School in Malibu that prepares young people to live consciously through passion-based learning, and on the board of Spark the Journey in Washington, D.C. that mentors low-income high school students to achieve college and career success. Her new book is Raising an Entrepreneur: How to Help Your Children Achieve Their Dreams. 99 stories from families who did. So Margot, welcome to the program. It's really great to have you today.
Thanks. I'm so excited to talk.
So let's just start by giving a little bit of context here. So obviously you're very involved in what it is like raising children who are entrepreneurs, but you've also spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. doing government work and so on. So give us a little feel about your journey, where you grew up, where you started, and kind of how you got to where you are today.
Wow. Okay. I grew up in the Midwest, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Evanston, Illinois. I went to Northwestern undergrad and business school, came to Washington, D.C. for a year. My husband says my year is almost up. And I worked on the Hill, and I worked at Treasury, and I worked at the Council of Economic Advisors, and I was an FTC Commissioner. During the 90s, I set up economic think tanks in Eastern Europe, which I have to tell you is really a conversation stopper in most places.
Okay.
So I've done a whole bunch of stuff like that. And so my dad was a professor, and I grew up in college towns, and everyone I knew had a PhD. And I always assumed that obviously, my kids would go to college. And so my older son, Elliot, 2.5 years into the University of Wisconsin, called us and said, I think I'm taking a break.
Okay.
I had to do a big gulp.
Yeah.
And I can tell you later why that was turned out to have been a really good decision. But in any event, he went to work with my husband, who had just started a company, and he really wanted to become an entrepreneur. And a year and a half later, he ended up cold calling 18 young people, young entrepreneurs under the age of 30, and inviting them for a ski weekend in Utah, thinking that otherwise he wasn't cool enough for them to talk to. And this was 2008. None of them had ever met anybody like themselves before. And it was turned out to be a very cool group of people who started Tom's Shoes and College Humor and OpenAI and lots of other really amazing companies. And they all said, you have to do it again. And I want to bring 6 friends. And that began Summit Series. And so
Wow.
he started doing this organization called Summit Series, which was conferences of young entrepreneurs. And I would go to these conferences, and I'd meet all these young people. And I asked them, like, how did you turn out the way you did? I was just so curious, like, you're willing to work so hard and take on so much risk to put your idea into motion and to see it through. And they all said the same thing to me. They all said, I had someone who believed in me, who told me I could do anything that I worked at hard enough. Usually that was a family member, more usually it was their mom, but not always. It was always somebody along the way who said that to them. And I was so struck by this. And I kept talking about it. And the kid said, you have to write a book. And I said, I can't write a book. And they said, you have to write a book. So they finally wore me down. And I just started interviewing people and asking them how they were raised. And I had no expectations. And I picked a very, very diverse group, half men, half women, every race, every religion, every socioeconomic background, small towns, big cities, small families, big families, married parents, divorced parents, single moms, born here, born overseas. I mean, going into for-profits, nonprofits, artists, just you name it, just hugely diverse. And to my amazement, they were basically all raised the same, which
Interesting. Yeah.
kind of blew my mind. And so that's what really got me on this path.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. And just going to hold up the book here for those on the video. It's a fantastic book. I really enjoyed it. It's one of those ones that's hard to put down because the stories are so compelling. Thanks for sharing your story with us. And we have a few things in common. I also am a Northwestern University grad,
Wow,
and
that's
I
that's
also
right.
yeah, and although I was it was graduate school for me, so I was in the downtown campus, but love that area. And my son was also discovered tennis too, which we knew absolutely nothing about. Which one of your sons is quite the tennis player, I understand. So we have some things in common. So I can't wait to talk to you because this idea or this concept that you're talking about is just fascinating to me because I do think, whether it's raising kids or, and those kids becoming successful business leaders, of the future and now, it's just really, really interesting. So I want to get into that a little bit. So for our audience, just define entrepreneur. When you say entrepreneur, what does that mean to you?
Thank you for asking, because I think my definition is different from other people's. My definition of an entrepreneur is anyone who starts anything,
Okay.
period.
Okay. That
Um,
makes it simple.
so my younger son started a band. He's an entrepreneur. You're an entrepreneur. You started a podcast and a coaching company.
Yeah.
Um, um, People who start nonprofits are entrepreneurs. People who start organizations within big organizations are entrepreneurs. Um, People who are any sort of artist are entrepreneurs. So I don't think it's just some guy with 1,000 employees. And in fact, my son said to me, Mom, make sure you don't just interview the billionaires because first of all, no disrespect, but they're all white guys. And,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's nice to expand the pool. Um, but also, basically, that's not what's going to happen for most people in the world. So I'm not saying do this and you can get $1 billion. I'm saying do this and find something you love that gives you joy, that you can start, that you can do, that you can take control of, and that you can enjoy doing with your life.
And I think, just being happy, like you just said, the joy and be happy in life. I mean, we all know a lot of people who are very successful and they have a boatload of money but are unhappy, so that's certainly not the definition of, a success in that sense. But I'm intrigued, and all the stories in the book were very similar, as you said, and we'll get into that for sure. But so here you come from a fairly traditional, childhood and growing up in a family that's more traditional. And it just must have been hard for you to, recognize that my two sons have come up with two things that I would never have thought of. And secondly, probably thought, well, how are you going to make money doing that, right? Because we want our kids to be stable and to be able to do things they want to do. Yet by letting them do what they have passion around, they become happy adults.
Right. I mean, so many people say to me, well, how can I let them do that? They might not make a living doing that. They should take this path where they can make a living. And I'm like, okay, so your solution is they should do something to make a living, even if they're really unhappy for the next 50 years. You think
Yeah.
that's a good plan. And, I know there's been a lot of writing lately about, should you follow your passion? The point is, if it's your passion, you're much more likely to work at it really, really hard and to get really, really good and to get a much better chance of being successful. And,
Yeah.
so no, it's not something you just think, oh, I kind of like to draw. Maybe I'll draw something. No, this is like, I'm doing this 5 hours a day. This is the thing I love the most.
Yeah, well, I've interviewed a lot of people. I know you have as well. And when you do look at the people that have really achieved real high success, whether it's in music or, art or whatever, it almost becomes an obsession for them, right? I mean, it's like they're in the bedroom all day long just doing something that probably driving their parents crazy, but it is what it gives them passion. And I think it's interesting to think about that because um, I think the millennial generation and the newer generations as well is teaching us baby boomers a lot about, it isn't about the long work week, and it isn't about, doing things with status. It's about doing what gives you joy, as you said, or being a happy person in the future. And that's really the key, I think.
Right. And if you love it and you work really hard at it, you're much more likely to be successful than if you're doing something you really can't stand and you're just putting in the time.
It's so interesting. I had a guest on here a few shows back, and he said when I was 8 years old, I was an artist. And I love to draw and I draw all these things, but my parents were just like, thought that was a waste of time. And so he said, quite frankly, I was pushed into doing something more traditional. So he said, I became a CFO of a company. I was making big money. I was in a big company as a CFO and I hated it. He goes, I just hated it. And so he said, I just gave it up and did something different. And he says, so now he's more of a life executive type coach. He's back to painting, and he goes, and being a coach and being helping people learn what's best for them is not that different from painting a picture. So I feel like I'm back to what I should have been doing from the get-go.
That's great. That's great. So every one of these entrepreneurs that I interviewed had a passion when they were growing up outside of school. And in every case, their parents supported that passion. And many of them don't do anything with that passion today. But because they had something they had chosen that they were passionate about, that they were working really, really hard at, that they were getting really, really good at, it gave them all the skills they then needed when they did become an entrepreneur, whether it was in that area or not. The artists, the dancers and the musicians and the movie directors, they kept up, basically the same passion.
Yeah.
But all the rest of them, they're not doing anything with the passion they had when they were young. But because they had that passion, they learned to work hard. They learned to pivot when things weren't going well. They learned that if they worked really hard, they would do better than when they didn't work really hard. They saw the trade-off between hard work and their results. They learned that failure, as Billie Jean King says, we don't call it failure, we call it feedback. So they learned that
Yeah.
failure was how they learned and grew and got better and stronger. And they learned that they could do something and they could get confident and they could believe in themselves. And they developed the personality so that, when the time came, they had the skills to be successful.
Now that you have this expertise writing the book, you sit on these boards of schools that are trying to, get into this energy and so on. How do you tell a parent, like, how do you know the difference between, like, one of the stories you tell in the book is about the kid who was just crazy about video games and he was always playing the video games or whatever. So how does a parent know when that's positive and he'll take that somewhere in the future, or it's someone who's depressed and doesn't want any social interaction and is just hanging out in his room being lazy or whatever? How do you know the difference?
I mean, that's a difficult question, and everybody asks me, and I mean, I think you just have to know your kid.
Yeah.
The person you're mentioning, Thomas View, uh, had immigrant parents who thought he'd become a doctor, and he always loved video games, and they were, as long as you can play all the video games you want, as long as you're getting good grades. And and they let him play football and they let him do all these other things, but his passion was always video games. And he ended up dropping out of college one semester before graduating to join the first intern class at Electronic Arts, and he ended up becoming the lead producer of League of Legends. Um,
Yeah.
which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And he said his mom used to call him like every couple months and say, "You sure you don't want to be a doctor?" Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm
but
sure.
But I mean, you just have to, you have to be alert and see, is your child getting joy? I don't know much about video games, but I mean, it's a whole world out there. And, there's people, they have teams and they're playing other teams and they're learning to make decisions, and they're learning to cut their losses, and they're learning to, take on challenges, and they're learning all sorts of things that are great for them. And if they love it and they seem to be thriving, I mean, you have to see if your child is thriving. If they're thriving, then great.
Yeah.
There's so many careers that just didn't exist when we were growing up.
And it's interesting too because I've interviewed entrepreneurs. I've read a lot of biographies of, and a lot of them don't finish school. It's almost like, am I correct in saying that schools a lot of times try and get everybody to conform to a certain way, and that would drive an entrepreneurial mind crazy. So they get to a point where they just can't succeed in that environment, therefore they just leave it.
So that was something that was sort of surprising to me. I'd say about a third of the entrepreneurs that I talked to were great students. They breezed through Ivy League schools, got advanced degrees, couple Rhodes Scholars. Um, about a third of them did not graduate, or I even didn't go to college. And probably half of them were miserable in school from the beginning, even if they did graduate. And like you say, most schools don't nurture entrepreneurial personalities. They want you to tell the teacher what the teacher told you. They want you to sit still quietly and listen to somebody lecturing you. And entrepreneurs question things and want to do things differently, and it rubs a lot of teachers the wrong way. So a lot of them don't go because they're frustrated, or, a lot of them just don't go because they want to get on with their life. They've started a business in college, and they, one of them told me he said, "You just don't have the bandwidth." John Arrow, he started Mutual Mobile, and he ended up dropping out a semester before he graduated. He said, "You just, at some point you have to decide, like, I'm really believe in this business, and I want to be all in with this business. I can't spend half my time studying for classes that I'm not interested." My son Elliot, who dropped out halfway through his junior year, he just, he had become really interested in business. They wouldn't let him take one business class because they had a prerequisite of calculus.
Oh, geez.
I
Yeah.
mean, I have a Kellogg MBA. I never took calculus. I mean, like, seriously? But anyhow, and he was looking at these classes that he just didn't want to spend the next year and a half taking. And I mean, I now realize that it was the best decision he made, because he did that first summit event a month before he would have graduated. And if he had stayed in school for another year and a half and then come out in another year and a half, the moment would have passed him by. I mean, it became an amazing event because it was the first time young entrepreneurs had ever gathered. So, I mean, I learned a lesson, like, you have to take a big gulp, and you have to let them see where the path leads.
Yeah, and there's another story in the book where a kindergarten teacher called the mother at home and said,
Hey,
you know,
Blanco.
okay, yeah, he won't he won't sit still, in a circle, and so his mom's response was, "So what?" But as the father of a first grade teacher, I can see that teacher probably saying, "Man, I need this kid to sit in a circle," whatever. But on the other hand, I guess you need to find ways for these kids to just express themselves that isn't the norm. It isn't what everyone else is doing.
No, and he's amazing. I mean, I'm sure he's the most successful person that's ever graduated from that high school. He's written like 25 number one songs, and I think he's currently engaged to Selena Gomez, and he's written a cookbook just because he loves to entertain his friends, and
Yeah.
he's just amazing. And
Yeah.
he just was different, and his mom
Yeah.
was like, cool, go for it.
Well, and speaking of moms, I mean, you're not shy by saying it right in the book that a lot of these entrepreneur children were supported, and embraced to do their thing mainly by their moms. I mean, you come out and say that that's a real key factor, and I think that's interesting. You're a mom yourself. You're not afraid to say that.
But there are also like a lot of dads who are, and especially now, I mean, this is, 10 years later, more and more, I think young dads are saying, I want to be there for my kids too, I mean, not just
Yeah.
there, but support them doing this different path. I mean, I think especially, 20 years ago, a lot more dads were, you have to take the traditional role. And it was the moms who were like, oh, come on, he loves this so much. Let him do that, kind of.
Yeah, yeah. That's I think that's really interesting. And you talk a lot in the book too about, believing in your child's strength, raising a child to be, proud of their skills, to be confident, to be fearless. And then, of course, strong work ethic. I think everyone agree with the strong work ethic. But you do see just in kids, family members I can think of and other kids I've been exposed to, there's some kids that are absolutely fearless, and then there's other kids that are afraid of everything. So you just wonder where that comes from or how that's part of their DNA.
Well, I think it also comes from how they're raised. I mean, parents who say, I'm so disappointed in the way you played that game, or I can't believe you missed that field goal and lost the game for your team, or I can't believe you did so badly on that test, or, I'm so embarrassed that you screwed up that way, or, whatever. And a kid like that is going to grow up being afraid to take risks because they're going to be afraid to fail. And the parents in this book, they all said, oh, what did you learn from that? What will you do differently next time? How do you think
Yeah.
you might have changed, or do you think you could have done it differently? One of the stories in the book that I love, the same guy, John Arrow, he said, I think he was in fourth grade, and they decided to write a newspaper about, and about all the kids in their class, and put in who liked whom, and they made stuff up, and it all sold out immediately, and the principal was furious, and told them never to do that again. And he said all his other friends got in trouble, and his parents thought it was hilarious.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, sometimes I've heard a lot too where, it's not great to tell your kid they're always smart, smart because if they start to identify with that, then they're afraid to try things that maybe that they would fail at because then they don't look smart. And if that becomes their identity, they can't be wrong or they can't fail because they're supposed to be so smart. And so, it's more to praise the effort and more to
Right.
praise, things like that. So, uh,
The
I was
growth
telling my
mindset.
wife, go ahead.
Well, the growth mindset versus the
Yeah,
fixed mindset.
right.
Studies have shown that kids who are praised for what they are, beautiful or talented or smart, do not do as well as kids who are praised for their effort.
Yeah. My wife and I were talking about this before I did this interview, and I was telling her what we were talking about, and she said, "Well, maybe we made a mistake when our youngest daughter, we were sitting at the ferry dock in Seattle, waiting for the ferry, and she said, "Can I go out and walk around the car?" So I'm waiting. We said, "Sure." So all of a sudden, it was a summer day. The windows were down. And all of a sudden, we heard this little voice saying, "Money for the poor, money for the poor," and she had her baseball cap up and was going up to the cars, and we're like, "Oh no, no, you can't do that. You can't do that." So maybe we should have let her do it, and maybe she'd be ahead of a huge nonprofit raising money for the poor today. Who knows?
Who knows?
Yeah, yeah, it's just crazy. So, another thing you said in the book that I thought was interesting, you said kids learn that good things happen, when they're doing things that they're having fun at. So, I think a lot of times we kind of get into this, succeed and meet these goals and meet these milestones and whatever. And maybe sometimes we can do that, but it isn't always fun. So you're saying they need to have fun and they need to really enjoy what they're doing.
Uh, I think it's important for parents to recognize that it's a different world today from the world when we grew up.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of parents think they have to force their kids to be on the same path that worked for them. And so they have to get good grades in all their classes, and they have to do lots of extracurricular activities, and they have to just be programmed constantly, and they have to get into the right college. And no, they don't. They
Yeah.
don't. It's not that world anymore. And look, if you have that kind of kid, that's great. You might have a kid who just loves to read their science all day and wants to be a doctor and knows exactly what they want to do. And that's terrific. But you might have a very different kind of child, and you have to recognize that. You have to deal with that. And if they're miserable doing the thing you thought they were going to be doing, let them try something different.
Yeah. Yet another thing that I think is interesting to me is in reading the book, how did you find all these entrepreneurs? Now, you mentioned that your son had got this group together at the summit, so I suppose some of them came out of there. But how do you find all these people? How do you know where the entrepreneurs are? I'm just intrigued. You have 99 stories, so how did you find 99
I
people to do
mean,
this?
I still go to these summit events. I'm going to the next one in Baja in November, and there will be, I don't know, 1,500 of them. I mean,
Yeah, there you go.
there
You
you
know, and I,
go.
and I think another trait that comes out too is that in leadership, we always say that we learn more from our failures than we do our successes. And so if that were true, maybe we should fail a lot more so we can accelerate our learning curve, which doesn't make sense. But yet a lot of these entrepreneurs are not afraid to fail. They're not afraid to try something. And if it doesn't work, well, they move on to the next thing or they learn from it and try something different. I think that's somewhat of a unique quality for your average kid, would you say?
I mean, I think it's probably the biggest difference between entrepreneurs and people who go into other professions. If you're a lawyer or a doctor or an architect or an accountant, you don't want to fail. Um, and if you work in the government, you don't want to fail. It's a very risk averse place. Uh, those are not the kind of people who are attracted to becoming entrepreneurs. And nobody starts a company and has it be perfect from the beginning. It just never happens that way. They
Yeah.
start something and then they have to change it a little bit. And then they have to, try to appeal to a different group of people. And then they have to change the marketing, and then they have to change the product a little bit. And, one of the reasons that I did this second edition of the book is half the people are doing something different from when I interviewed them 10 years ago for the first edition.
Yeah.
They sold their company, or they merged their company, or they moved on from their company, or they decided to try something else. And all the companies evolve and change and grow, and that's how it works. And if you're not creative, if you're not willing to take risks, if you're not willing to try different things, if there's a culture of fear about failure, you're not going to be an entrepreneur.
When my wife and I had little kids, we thought, we should learn as much as we can. So we took a parenting class, a series of parenting classes, and I always remember what the guy said. He said, you can't expect to raise kids in today's world using the authoritarian style that you grew up with in your family. And I thought, wow, that is so true. And then another, related to that in the book, this Alexis Jones, she said that whenever she wanted something, her mom would just say, "Okay, well, let's negotiate. What do you want, and let's see how to get it." And I find that so interesting because my daughter has a little girl now, my first granddaughter, and she's always negotiating with her. And there's a part of it kind of like you say, just tell her what to do, But it's like, no, she's negotiating. So I think that's really a different style of parenting.
It is. It is. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just think it's great. Anyway, Alexis Jones was quite a story. She's got a couple entries in your book because I think she is doing different things. And she said another thing that I thought was interesting was she said, I never had to lie because my mom just told me I can handle anything. Whatever you want to tell me, you tell me, I can handle it. And for that reason, she said all her girlfriends were telling their parents lies and not being upfront and not being transparent with it. She goes, I told my mom everything, and so the mom was okay with that.
Right, and her mom always said, like, never let, never let a lack of money stand in the way of your fulfilling your dreams, which I
Yeah.
love.
Well,
Um,
yeah, and I think we do get, a lot of people say money always gets in the way, right? So, um, if it's all, and I'm a huge believer that you need to do things for the right reasons, and probably making money isn't a good one. Obviously, we want to be able to support our families and provide for them and be as, somewhat comfortable in our lives. Yet, if that's the main goal, if that's the only goal, I think it becomes hollow in the long run.
right, and, I mean, I never talked to one of these people who said their goal was to make money.
Yeah.
Their goal was always to make a better product or to make a better service or to improve the world in some way. Or to make something better, to better people's lives. I think entrepreneurs are compassionate people. They are people who want to build a better world. And I'm not just talking about, the people who start nonprofits. I mean, successful companies are built because people want to do things better and make people's lives better. You,
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
no, I think it's just so great. Like Jonathan Neiman started Sweet Green because he wanted better food to eat, better, fast, quick food to eat. And his whole thing now is partnerships with local farmers and, having them do regenerative farming and caring about the food and the products and the relationships with the local farmers. And I mean, you can do well by doing, good.
Absolutely. Another theme in the book too is you talk a lot about how you think sports are really good for kids, and even if they suck at it, it's good that they're involved in the competition and whatever. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think that learning to compete is really key. I was amazed how many of these entrepreneurs played sports at an elite level, like into college, even though none of them does anything with sports professionally. I was almost afraid I was going to have to say you had to be an athlete to become an entrepreneur. And I didn't want to have to say that. And of course, it turned out that's not true. Some of them were competing in lots of other ways, but I'd be like, oh, and did you do anything with sports growing up? And oh yeah, I was on the Olympic development team for skiing. Oh yeah, I was the national equestrian champion. Oh yeah, I played basketball at Brown. Oh yeah, I played soccer at Cornell. I mean, and on and on and on, because these people, they learn to compete, they learn to fail, they learn to pivot, they learn the trade-off between hard work and results. And they strive and they learn to get better. I don't know if you heard Roger Federer's commencement address at Dartmouth in May, and
I did not.
it's
I love
fab.
Roger Federer.
You listen to it on YouTube; it's fabulous. But anyhow, here's the greatest tennis player of my lifetime probably, and he said even though he won 80% of his matches, he lost almost 50% of the points he played in matches.
I have seen that quote. Yes.
That
Yeah.
if you focus on the bad thing that happened in the past, you're never going to be successful. Figure out what you did wrong, figure out how you can change it, move on, look ahead, keep going. I
Yeah.
mean, you know, that's training for life.
No, no question. And I think it's, you look at that and of course we already talked about, learning from your mistakes or learning from your failures, but also there's that piece, that resilient piece, your son, one of your sons is a musician, and if you talk to most musicians that have made it, the amount of rejection that they have, that people tell them you don't have it, you're not talented enough, it's too hard, the business, only very few make it. I mean, talk about a daunting thing in front of you, but but some of them hang in there and they're resilient and they make it work.
Yeah, no, I'm so proud of him.
Yeah.
Uh,
Tell us a little about him. He's is that Magic Giant? Is
and Giant,
yeah.
and it's a wonderful band, and we just saw them play at in Colorado Springs. They opened for One Republic in a brand new auditorium, a brand new amphitheater.
Wow.
Super exciting for us. Um, and you know, he just keeps grinding out music, and then in addition, he and his wife have started singing together something very different, kind of a quieter kind of folk duo called
Hmm.
Somewhere in Between. And we're going to New York to see their show in a couple weeks up for that also.
Say the
But
name again. Say the name again.
Somewhere in Between.
Somewhere in between. Okay.
And also I was thinking before we talked, because I noticed that, you know, you said you're really interested in what people are doing to help the planet. And every time someone buys one of their albums, they donate to One Tree Planted.
Mm,
They plant a tree every time you buy an album. And
that's awesome.
I think he said they've planted over 10,000 trees so far, which
Wow.
which is really beautiful.
Yeah, you look back on the legacy, that you have and you have these accomplishments, but something that lives for generations. I mean, that's got to be a feel good thing.
But it's funny because you said you have a son who plays tennis and you don't play tennis. We have a son who plays tennis. We don't play tennis. We are the only two people I've ever met whose kids were serious about tennis, where the parents don't know anything about. I swear I'd go to these tournaments with the top 100 kids in the country, and I was the only one who didn't know the rules. But but Austin started writing music about the same time Elliot started playing tennis, and we don't know anything about music. And it was only actually when I wrote the book that I realized how great it was that both our kids had passions in areas we knew nothing about.
Yeah, and I think you say it somewhere in the book too, where I have a note here that says, that encourage your kids for that curiosity they have, because all kids are curious, and I think if you can keep that going as opposed to stifle it in some way, people don't stifle it on purpose probably, but having that curious, that's why they ask why 7,000 times when they're toddlers. They're just curious about things.
But this is how companies are made, right? People say, why does it have to be that way? Can it be done better? How could I make it different? How could I change it? How could I make it more attractive? How could I make it more interesting? How could I make it more sustainable? How could I make it more healthy? Right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
exactly.
that's how products get made, because people are asking questions. And so all of these things that you're mentioning that are important characteristics of entrepreneurs that they developed growing up, they're also why they're successful today, because they have those characteristics as entrepreneurs, as adults, right? They're
Yeah, right.
they're risk takers, they're hard workers, they have grit, you
Yeah.
know, they're resilient. And these are all traits that are lead to being successful.
And I think a lot of times, you read the Angela Duckworth, books and her studies, and you say it in your book too, that grit is such an important kind of thing to have, to be successful in life. Yet, you'd say that to most people. Well, how do you develop grit? That's the okay. I think a lot of people would just, bail out and say, oh, you either have it or you don't. But I don't think that's true. I think you develop it.
You develop it because you're working hard at something you love, and
Yeah.
your parents are proud of you for the success in that. They don't say, stop wasting time on music and go study your trigonometry, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Or
And
yeah, just those messages you think back, yeah, it might just take somebody that, that's why I love doing these interviews, because I hear these stories all the time where somebody took an interest in somebody that another adult didn't, and it just sparked this passion that then they became who they are because someone believed in them and someone wanted to know more about it and helped them get to where they are. And it's um, I look at it two ways. I look at it as so exciting, but I also look at it as daunting. Like, geez, I hope I didn't stifle some kid, when I wasn't really knowing what I was doing. So,
I'm sure you didn't.
oh gosh. Well, and in the book you talk about, there's kind of these 10 rules that that most entrepreneurs go by. You said that you interviewed all these people and they all kind of have the same story, and there's 10 rules that most of them abide by. And one of them that I think was interesting is I think it's number 10, is it's a lead by following. So that sounds counterintuitive. That sounds like something we don't always hear. So explain that a little bit more.
Well, that's kind of what we were talking about. My son started writing music when he was 13, and he was doing it like 5 hours a day, and he just loved it so much. And we had to let him do it, and we always knew he could be successful doing something in music. I mean, we didn't know if he could make it in a band, but we knew he could be successful because he loved it and he worked so hard. We didn't know anything about music. We just got out of the way. And like Thomas View's parents with the video games, and all these other people. I mean, my son Elliot with tennis, and so many of these people, whatever it was that their kids wanted to do, the parents said, wow, that's what you want to do. That's great. We love that you're doing it. We love that you're working so hard. We know you're going to be successful. We're here for you for the inevitable failures. And we just are going to watch your journey, and we know you're going to be great. And they didn't say, of course, you can take music lessons in high school, but in college you have to major in something useful.
Yeah.
They didn't,
Yeah.
they didn't say, stop spending so much time, building that silly thing and go back to studying your whatever,
Yeah.
meteorology, whatever you,
Well,
15th century history.
and I think the key there is what the kid or what the younger person really wants to do. I mean, we've seen the abuses on the other side too, where it's not exactly what they want to do, and they're pushed into that, and then it gets concerning when all of a sudden, you're moving the whole family to support this kid's um, journey to be what maybe isn't exactly what they want to be, and the pressure's too much. It's got to be something that they themselves really like, not the parent who's living through their kid.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, I always think about remember the college admissions scandal, Varsity
Yeah.
Blues?
Yeah.
And all these people were saying, oh man, these wealthy kids, their parents are being so helpful. And I was just thinking, oh my gosh, these poor kids, their parents were giving them the worst possible signal that any parent could possibly give their child. What these parents were saying is, if the school knew the real you, they wouldn't want you. And we have to pretend you're somebody different from what you are, because otherwise you can't be successful in life.
Yeah. That's
What a thing to tell your child.
Yeah, it's just crazy. And you hate to generalize because there's always exceptions to everything and whatever, but I do see a lot in some of the immigrant families, that come and they kind of have the four things that they want their kids to do because they think that's what's going to be successful. And you talk to a lot of kids who say, well, I'm or adults now that say, this is what I do for my career, but it's not really my passion because I was kind of pushed into this because my family thought, my parents thought that was important. And yes, I am financially stable, but you know maybe they're not as happy as they could be.
But see, that's the thing that gets me, like every parent in this book, that's not what they did.
Yeah.
And you're right, like for the immigrant parents, sometimes that was the biggest gulp, because they had it in their head that their kid was going to be the doctor or whatever. But every one of these parents, when they realized how much joy their child was getting out of what they were doing, they ended up supporting them. And Thomas View, who we mentioned, who, went on to do League of Legends. John Chu, the movie director, who's going to come, he did Crazy Rich Asians, and he's coming out with Wicked in November. And his parents ran a restaurant. They wanted him to be, very kind of traditional. And he was doing movies from 4th grade on. And he was in high school and he was doing a movie on his, laptop when he was supposed to be sleeping. And his mom came into his room and said, put that away and get ready for school. You need some sleep so you do well in school tomorrow, and stop wasting your time on this. And he burst into tears and said, you can't make me stop. I love this. It's what I want to do with my life. And she said, go to sleep. We'll talk in the morning. And when she picked him up at school the next day, she'd gone to the library and she'd gotten 10 filmmaking books. And she said, if you want to do it, be the best.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
from then on, he said his parents were always like the most supportive in
Yeah.
every way. And it's just, yeah, it's like a big gulp. It's like, I'm a professor's kid. My kid dropped out of college, you know? I
Yeah.
mean, you have to see who your kid is and where they're going and what they want and what makes them happy. And the solution is not for them to spend 40 years being miserable to put bread on the table,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, and I think, yeah, you do see certain professions. Again, I hate to generalize, but there's a lot of attorneys that I know that love the idea of them being an attorney, and their parents love the idea that they're an attorney, but they hate it.
Right.
It's a grind. It's all about billable hours, and you're working these horrendous hours. It's not even, like one of my friends said, the trouble with attorneys is they don't create anything. They just interpret what's already there. So it's kind of like, then that's probably not fair description either. But you'd hate to be 45 years old and have all these expenses and all these things you're trying to maintain, but hating what you do, because then it's really hard to change.
So my husband was an attorney for a short while,
Okay.
and we lived in Washington, DC. So we know hundreds of attorneys, and I think we knew two of them who loved their job.
Yeah. I know. It's kind of scary. Yeah, for sure. So, in doing this research and writing the book, and maybe we've already covered it, but I'm going to ask anyway. What was the real aha for you when you look back on it, and when you say, "Wow, this is something I wish I would have known as a young adult, or even in my teenage years"? What did you learn about all that research that really opened your eyes?
So what really opened my eyes was that every one of these entrepreneurs, despite how different all their families were, that they were raised the same. And the main way that they were raised the same is that every one of them had a passion outside of school, and every one of their parents supported that passion. And sometimes those passions morphed over time. It was one thing for 5 years and then a different thing for the next 5 years and a different thing for the next 5 years. But their parents could see they were thriving, and their parents were there for them and were just proud of them, and were supportive of their journey. And I just think it's so important. It's certainly not what I expected. I'd come from, as you said, like a very traditional background. It just didn't occur to me. Um, it worked out,
Yeah.
but it didn't occur to me when my kids were growing up. And I just think so many parents, they're just kind of in that tunnel where they just think, God, he's got to do this, he's got to do this, he's got to do this, he's got to do this. And they don't ever step back and say what gives them joy. So many of them say, well, I don't know what their passion is. And I'm thinking, that's because you've never given them the space to figure it out. You've never watched them. You've never looked at them. My son's son was getting ready for kindergarten this year, and I got to go with him to different schools as they were trying to figure out where to send him. And one of the schools had asked the kindergartners what they wanted to be when they grew up, and they all had to draw a picture and write the words. And here these kids are 5 years old, and it was like firefighter, actor, policeman, astronaut, nurse, teacher. You know, they're they're 5 years old. They already know that there's something they love that's different from what everybody else loves. Every child is unique. Every child is born with a gift. Our job as a parent is to figure out with them what that is, and then to nurture it, and then to support it, and then to tell them how proud we are that they're succeeding in that. And I
Yeah.
didn't know that when my kids were growing up.
It's I'm going to butcher the exact quote, but it was something, I think it was from Picasso, that said, are you a, lifelong artist? And he said, well, I was the only kid who didn't listen to their parents about, coloring within the lines and doing it this way or that way. I just did it my own way, and I never listened to them. So I thought, again, I butchered the quote, but it's something to that effect, that, they were just driven to do it their way. And so it's really interesting. it makes me, and I think another point that you made that I think is worth saying again is that let's take the music industry for an example. Uh, what your son did. The odds of someone being successful in that industry is really, really tough.
So I'm not
But
sure I agree with that. The odds of them becoming a pop star are really
right.
tough.
Well,
The
I
odds of
guess,
them
yeah.
finding a job in the music industry are probably not so tough.
Well,
And
that's a good point. Yeah.
maybe they try it and try to become a pop star and that doesn't work. And they think, but I really I was working with this other kid who was trying to become a pop star and I really kind of enjoyed mentoring him. Maybe I'll do that, and then they find that, what I really was enjoying doing was I wrote these little songs and they didn't make it as pop songs, but they might really make it, for in movies or in TV shows or, there's something.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah. Well, and they learn something in that journey, even if they don't become the pop star, as you're saying. It may not even be in the industry, but they learn lessons all along the way that teach them, how to maneuver through life in a way that keeps them curious, keeps them happy. And so I think it bodes well to say, don't discourage those, way out things because you never know. You never know what they'll learn along the way.
You never know.
Yeah. So, Margot, in anticipation of our discussion today, is there anything that I haven't asked or we haven't covered that you want to be sure and get in the program today?
No, this has been just super fun. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and so have I. I mean, it's fascinating to me because, it's what I do. I'm a leadership coach. I help people communicate with other humans and help them, work with their teams so they perform better and whatever. And this goes all the way. You have to be careful how you say this, because people might get offended, but it's not a whole lot different than dealing with kids, helping them as, little ones and toddlers and then they get into their teenage years and whatever. I mean, the principles are very similar, and just helping people see that and embrace it in a positive way to nurture people as opposed to stifle people, I think, is a real key factor.
No, absolutely. And everything that these parents did that enabled their kids to be successful, then when they become entrepreneurs and they have companies, they put into practice these same policies in their companies, so they support their employees. They encourage risk taking and creativity. They don't berate somebody when something fails. They applaud people trying new approaches. They try to, maintain work-life balance. They support their community. They support, their suppliers. They try to look broadly and see how can we make it better? How can it be improved? How can we go to the next level? They're always learning and thinking and inquiring and challenging and testing and, moving on from failure and learning and growing. And it's the same thing, it makes them successful in business.
Yeah, and I think it's true too, what I've always said too, when people ask me about burnout, why is the burnout rate so high today and maybe compared to the past? And my answer to that is somewhat to the same in the sense that the human species has shown an unbelievable capacity for hard work over long periods of time. So that's not what causes burnout. It's when you're doing that and you don't understand the purpose or you don't have the purpose or you don't have the passion, you're doing it for the wrong reasons.
Right.
Because I think a lot of those entrepreneurs will tell you, man, I don't count how many hours I work because I'm just loving it, doing it all the time, so it's not like work life. It's kind of it's together. It's their life. And so I think that's a common thread too.
Right. They all told me if you love what you do, you don't work a day in your life. And I work harder than anyone else because I love what I do and I just keep trying and I keep persisting and I'll never give up.
Yeah, and I think too that's a really good point too, because I do think some young professionals get into something that they thought they were going to love and they thought they should do it and they just don't. But then they're afraid to change. It's a status thing, or they quit, or they do something else, or they can't find what they want. So I think it's okay. It may take somebody a few times at it to find that passion and to find what's really going to make them happy throughout their life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Margot, at this time of the interview, I always ask my guests the same common question. So that question is, in relation to leadership, what is a pearl of wisdom that you could leave us with today?
I would say you can only do the best that you can do.
Yeah. Well, that's direct and to the point. Appreciate it. Well, Margot, this has been a real pleasure. I'm fascinated with the topic. Your book is fantastic. Highly recommend it to people. They can find that on Amazon, I
Yep.
suppose.
Yep.
Okay.
Amazon.
Okay. There it is. Yeah, it's a great book. It's very interesting, and I've always loved reading about people's journeys, and there's a lot of good information in there. So, thanks for sharing that with us, and thanks for telling us your journey. And it was sure an enjoyable interview. So, thank you for your time today.
I enjoyed it, Steve. Thanks so much.
Okay, take care. Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. To listen to all my interviews, subscribe to Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, and many other popular podcast platforms. Some of these interviews are on video, and you can search YouTube for Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson. You can also access the entire library of interviews on my website, orange.coaching.com, and that is orangetheword.coaching.com, and go to the Media Center and click on Podcasts or Video Gallery. You can also enter the website from pilpodcast.com.